She's just a combat nurse, they mocked, until she saved 17 soldiers in one night. The first truck arrived at 11:47 at night. Not the second truck. Not the third. The first one, and it was already too late for two of the men inside it. Margaret Wilkins had her sleeves rolled up before the driver cut the engine. She had heard the gears grinding half a mile out, the way the engine strained on the mountain road, and she already knew. That kind of sound meant weight. Too much of it. Too many men packed into a space built for half that number. She pushed through the tent flap and stood in the dark, and the cold hit her face like a flat palm. Korea in October had a particular kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin. It went through it. It found your spine and stayed there. Margaret had been at the 87th 6th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital for 22 days, and she still hadn't gotten used to that cold. She wasn't sure she ever would. The truck stopped. The back panel dropped. She moved. Nobody told her to. No doctor had called her name. No orderly had come running to say they needed extra hands. Margaret Wilkins moved because that was the thing about her. She didn't wait to be needed. She could see need before it announced itself, the way some people could feel rain before a cloud appeared. The first man she reached was conscious but barely. His name, she would learn later, was Private Owen Carr. He was 19 years old, from a small town in Tennessee, and he had been hit by shrapnel in 3 separate places along his left side. He was gripping the side of the truck with one hand, and had the look of a person who understood, somewhere deep and wordless, that letting go meant something permanent. "I have you," Margaret said. Just that. Nothing more. She didn't say it to comfort him. She said it because it was true, and because the truth was the only thing worth offering a man in that condition. She got under his arm, she took the weight, and she walked him toward the light. That was how Margaret Wilkins's nights in Korea began. Not with ceremony, not with recognition, just a woman walking a stranger toward a lamp, carrying more than her share, the way she had always done. She had not come to Korea because the army made it glamorous. In 1950 it wasn't. The recruitment notices for army nurses read like job listings for housekeepers in uniform. Supportive, careful, obedient. Margaret had read those words and felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite amusement. It was the feeling she got whenever something presented itself as the full truth while hiding half of it. She had applied anyway, because the alternative was a hospital in Columbus, Ohio, where the most critical decision she would make on any given Tuesday was which doctor's coffee order came first. She was not built for that kind of work. She was built for this. Her mother had cried when she left. Her father had shaken her hand, which was more than he gave her brothers when they enlisted. She took that handshake and kept it in the back of her mind, like a coin she could take out and look at when things got hard. Things got hard almost immediately. The 8076th was run, in practical terms, by Captain Leonard Cole. He was a surgeon from Connecticut who wore his authority the way some men wore expensive watches, constantly, and in a way designed to ensure you noticed. He was not a bad doctor. He was, by all measurable accounts, a very good one. But he had a particular arrangement of the world inside his head, and in that arrangement, nurses were furniture. Necessary furniture, but furniture. He had looked at Margaret on her first morning and said, to the orderly standing next to him, and not to her directly, "We're getting younger every month." Margaret was 26. She did not correct him. She had learned early, in nursing school and then in the hospital in Columbus, that correcting men like Leonard Cole was like pushing a door that only opened from the other side. You could push all you liked. The door didn't move, and you tired yourself out for nothing. So she watched, and she listened, and she learned the 87/6th, the way a careful person learns a new neighborhood, not by asking for directions, but by walking every street, until the map was hers. She learned which orderly cut corners on wound checks after midnight, when he thought no one was watching. His name was Frank Adler, and he was not a bad person. He was just tired, the way everyone at the 8076th was tired. And tired people simplify. They round down. They tell themselves close enough is close enough. Margaret made it her business to walk behind Frank Adler's rounds with her own flashlight and her own eyes, not to report him, but to catch what he missed. She caught things, more than she expected. There was a patient named Corporal Danny Hewitt, who was signed off as stable on a Wednesday evening. Margaret sat with him for 10 minutes during her own break and noticed that his breathing had a shallow, uneven quality that wasn't in his chart. She flagged it to the duty physician, a quiet man named Dr. Philip Grubb, who was new enough to the unit that he still listened without defensiveness. Grubb examined Hewitt, found early signs of a developing infection in the surgical site, and adjusted the treatment plan. Hewitt made it home. Grubb thanked her. He was one of the few who did. Cole never found out. Or if he did, he didn't mention it. Margaret preferred it that way. Recognition from Cole felt like something she'd have to pay for eventually, and she wasn't interested in that kind of economy. What she was interested in those first weeks, was mastery. She borrowed a field medical manual from the supply sergeant, a large, unhurried man named George Pine, who had been in the Army long enough to find nothing surprising, and lent books to anyone who asked, without demanding explanation. She read it in her bunk at night with a small flashlight, her coat pulled over her shoulders against the cold, and she read it the way she had read everything since she was a child, like it was something she needed to know before something happened that she couldn't predict. She read about tension pneumothorax, about needle decompression, about the window of time between a symptom appearing and a situation becoming irreversible. She read it more than once. She did not know, lying in that bunk with her flashlight and her coat, that she was preparing for a specific night. She was not prophetic. She was just a person who understood, in her body and her bones, that preparation was the only honest answer to a world that didn't warn you. 3 weeks after she arrived, at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, a soldier named Private Darnell Hooks stopped breathing correctly. He had come out of surgery 4 hours earlier, stable, unremarkable on paper. He was young, 21. And he had the look of someone who had been athletic before the war, and hadn't quite adjusted yet to what the war was turning his body into. Margaret was doing her night rounds when she heard it. Not a sound exactly. An absence of the right sound. A chest that wasn't moving the way a chest should move. She knew what it was before she had the name for it. The name came half a second later, out of the manual she had read in her bunk, 3 weeks ago, by flashlight. Tension pneumothorax. She turned and looked for the duty physician. He wasn't there. His tent was dark. He had been called to an emergency on the other side of the unit 20 minutes earlier and had not yet returned. There was no orderly in the recovery room. Frank Adler was on his break. There was Margaret Wilkins, and there was Darnell Hooks, and there was a window of time that was closing. She had never performed a needle decompression. She had only read about it. She thought about that for exactly the length of time it took her to cross the room. She found the supplies she needed. Her hands did not shake. She would think about that later, the fact that her hands did not shake, and she would not entirely understand it. She was afraid. She was genuinely, completely afraid. But fear and action were not opposites, and she had known that since she was old enough to know anything worth knowing. She did what the manual described, precisely, carefully, without a sound beyond what the work required. Hooks's chest expanded. His color came back. His breathing evened out into something that belonged to a living person. Margaret stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides. Then she wrote it up in the chart, clearly and completely, and went back to her rounds. Cole called her into his tent the next morning. He had the chart in his hand. He read the relevant section in a voice that had no particular temperature. Then he put the chart down and looked at her. "You exceeded your scope," he said. "Yes," she said. If something had gone wrong, it didn't. The tent was quiet. Outside, someone was moving equipment, and the metal-on-metal sound of it came through the canvas walls clearly. Cole looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She did not fill the silence, because the silence was his problem, not hers. "Back to your station," he said. She turned and walked out. She buttoned the top button of her jacket before stepping into the cold. Private Darnell Hooks was sitting up in his cot 2 days later, when she passed through recovery. He watched her the way people watch someone they are trying to find words for, and haven't managed it yet. She gave him a small nod. He nodded back. That was enough. That was more than enough. The mountains were visible from the east side of the unit on clear mornings. They were gray and enormous and strangely still, the kind of still that made you feel like the world had paused to think about something. Margaret wrote to her mother about them. She said they looked almost like Ohio, in the way that a thing can look like something familiar while being entirely itself. She wrote, "I am learning things here that I don't have words for yet. I think I will find the words later. I am keeping notes." She sealed the letter. She went back to work. 22 days in Korea. And the hardest night of her life hadn't started yet. The morning of October 14th arrived without announcing what it carried. That was the thing about it that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. There was no heaviness in the air, no particular silence, no sign that the day was different from the one before it. The mountains looked the same. The cold felt the same. The unit woke up and ate breakfast and moved through the early hours like a place that expected an ordinary day. Dr. Philip Grubb was in a good mood. He had received a letter from his wife the evening before, the first in 3 weeks, and he was moving through the ward with the particular lightness of a man who has been reminded that somewhere, outside of all of this, his life was waiting for him. He paused at the door of the recovery ward and told Margaret that his wife had sent a photograph of their dog. He described the dog for longer than the situation required. Margaret listened. She asked what the dog's name was. Augustus, Grubb said, with the slight embarrassment of a man who named his dog something dignified and still felt the need to explain it. She smiled. She meant it. That was the last unhurried conversation she would have for the next 19 hours. The intelligence failure, when it was explained to them later, was a layered thing, the kind that happens when multiple small errors stack on top of each other until the stack tips. A forward observation post had reported enemy movement 2 ridgelines east. The report was logged. A second report, which described that movement as significantly larger and faster than the first, was delayed by a communication blackout that lasted 11 hours. By the time the second report reached anyone with the authority to act on it, the situation it described had already changed shape entirely. The front did not hold. It moved. It moved quickly, and it moved toward them. The first casualties reached the 87 6th at 2:17 in the afternoon. A truck, then another truck, 20 minutes behind it, then a third, that arrived with a blown front tire and had to stop 200 meters short of the unit and be unloaded by hand. Cole called everyone to stations. He had the voice of a man who moved well in emergencies, clipped, clear, without wasted syllables. Whatever else Margaret thought of Leonard Cole, she respected that voice. She had heard it crack once, in a situation that would have cracked anyone, and she had watched him pull it back together in the space of a breath, and she had filed that away too. The surgeries began at 2:45. Cole took one table. Grubb took the other. The 2 OR nurses, a woman named Clara Webb and a quiet, precise woman named Ruth Ellison, who had been at the unit since July and knew every instrument by feel, worked alongside them without needing to be directed. Margaret was assigned to triage. She was given Frank Adler and a young orderly named George Peel, 19 years old, 3 months in country, still carrying the expression of someone who had not yet fully accepted what he had walked into. George was not slow or stupid. He was simply new. And new, in a triage ward that was filling faster than it was emptying, was its own kind of problem. She assigned him the simplest things: vital signs, blankets, talking to the men who needed someone to talk to them. He was good at the talking. His voice was steady in a way that didn't match his eyes, and that was exactly the quality a frightened man needed to hear. The afternoon passed in the way that overwhelming things pass. Not slowly, not quickly, but in pieces, each piece demanding total attention so that you could never see the whole shape of what you were inside. By 6 in the evening, they had received 41 patients. By 8, the number was 53. The OR was running without pause. Cole had not left the surgical table except to move from one patient to the next. His scrub shirt was soaked through. He did not appear to notice. Ruth Ellison handed him instruments in the dark silence of total concentration, and the two of them functioned with the wordless efficiency of people who had been doing the same thing in the same terrible conditions long enough to need no communication beyond the work itself. Grubb lost a patient at 6:40. Margaret heard the change in the sound of the OR, a particular quiet that meant a particular thing, and she pressed on, because pressing on was the only response available. Grief in a place like this was not denied. It was deferred. There was a time for it that was not now, and everyone at the 87th understood that without needing to be told. Margaret moved through the triage ward with her clipboard and her flashlight, evaluating, re-evaluating, moving men from one category to another as their conditions shifted. Triage was not a single decision. It was a continuous series of decisions, each one provisional, each one subject to revision, and the ability to hold that provisionality without panic, to keep reassessing without getting attached to previous assessments, was the core skill of it. Not everyone had it. Some people, faced with the need to constantly revise their understanding, froze at the revision. Margaret did not freeze. She moved. At 8:15, she noticed the man in the corner. He had arrived with the third truck. He had walked in under his own power, which had placed him, in the initial triage pass, in the lowest priority category. He was sitting on a cot against the far wall with his back straight and his hands on his knees, and he was the quietest person in a room full of loud, desperate noise. That quiet was wrong. Margaret crossed to him. His name was Private Alan Norris. He was 23 years old, from a town in West Virginia whose name she didn't catch, and when she looked at his face, she saw something that she had learned to recognize over 3 weeks of night rounds and borrowed medical manuals read by flashlight. His face was the face of someone whose body was working very hard to appear fine while something inside it was failing. She put her hand on his wrist. His pulse was fast and faint in the way that said his heart was trying to compensate for something it couldn't compensate for much longer. She looked at his abdomen. He hadn't mentioned abdominal pain. He would not have mentioned it. Men in that condition rarely mentioned the thing that was actually wrong. They had a tendency to report the last thing that hurt them rather than the thing that was going to kill them. "When did you last eat?" she asked him. It was not the question she was trying to answer. It was a way of watching his face while she pressed carefully along his lower left side. He winced, small, controlled, the kind of wince that a man allows himself only when he has failed to prevent it. She made a decision. She stood up, turned, and went directly to the OR tent entrance. She pulled the flap back. Cole was mid-procedure. She knew better than to interrupt mid-procedure. She also knew what she had just put her hand on. "Captain Cole," she said. He did not look up. "Not now, Lieutenant. I have an abdominal presentation in triage. His pressure is dropping." "Noted. There's a Q. He won't survive the Q." Cole looked up then, just briefly. He looked at her face, not her words. He was the kind of man who trusted face, and he made a small decision of his own in the 2 seconds of that look. "Grubb," he said. Grubb looked up from his table. "Take the next break in your case and evaluate triage. Lieutenant Wilkins has a concern." Grubb nodded. Margaret let the tent flap fall and went back to Alan Norris. Grubb came out 12 minutes later. He evaluated Norris for 4 minutes. He went back to the OR and said something to Cole that Margaret couldn't hear. Cole nodded without looking up from his work. Alan Norris went into surgery at 9:03 that evening. He would be, at the end of the night, the 16th man whose life turned on a decision Margaret Wilkins made in that ward. But that number was still hours away. The worst of the night had not yet arrived. The communication blackout that had delayed the second intelligence report was still causing cascading effects along the front, and the trucks had not stopped coming, and somewhere in the dark outside the perimeter of the 87th, the night was building toward something that none of them could see yet. George Peel brought Margaret a cup of water at 9:30. He held it out without saying anything, and she took it and drank it without stopping what she was doing, and that small, wordless exchange, a 19-year-old boy from somewhere passing a cup of water to a woman who was too busy to ask for it, was the most human moment of the entire day. She handed the cup back. She kept moving. The radio in Cole's command tent had been giving intermittent updates since mid-afternoon. A voice from somewhere further up the line reading coordinates and casualty estimates in the flat, affectless tone of someone who had learned to separate the numbers from what the numbers meant. At 9:47, the voice said something that made the orderly who was monitoring it, an older man named Sergeant Harold Birch, stand up from his chair and walk directly to Cole's OR tent. He did not interrupt. He waited outside. But the quality of his waiting was visible from across the compound. Margaret saw it. She looked at Harold Birch's back, at the particular set of his shoulders, at the way he was standing with his weight slightly forward, and she felt something shift in the temperature of the night. More trucks were coming. Not in a few hours. Now. The artillery started at 10:15. Not close enough to threaten the unit directly, but close enough that the sound was not distant. Close enough that the tent walls moved with each concussion. Close enough that the men in the recovery ward who were not fully sedated became aware of it in the way that people who have been near artillery before become aware of it. Not with fear exactly, but with a particular alertness, a kind of full-body listening. George Peel's hands were steady. Margaret noticed that. She made a point of noticing it, because he needed someone to notice it, and she was the person available. Good, she said to him, without specifying what was good. He understood. 4 more trucks arrived between 10:15 and 10:50. The triage ward went from organized to overloaded in the space of 30 minutes. Margaret moved through it like a current, always in motion, always orienting toward the next most critical thing, her flashlight beam moving across faces and hands and breathing patterns the way a lighthouse beam moves, steadily, without hesitation, covering the same ground repeatedly because the ground kept changing. At 11:10, the power generator faltered. The lights in the OR dimmed, then came back, then dimmed again. Cole's voice came through the tent wall. Clear, steady, not a single wasted word. Birch. Generator. Now. Birch was already moving. The lights came back fully at 11:14. The 4 minutes in between were managed with flashlights and the particular focused calm of people who have decided that panic is not an option they are prepared to choose. Margaret was in the middle of a re-evaluation when the generator went. She finished the re-evaluation by flashlight. She did not slow down. Outside, the mountains were invisible in the dark. The artillery continued its low, ongoing conversation with itself somewhere beyond the ridge. The trucks kept coming. And Margaret Wilkins kept moving. The night was not half over. The artillery was louder by midnight. Not closer. The 87 Sixth's position had not changed, and the perimeter was holding, but the rhythm of it had shifted. Earlier in the night, it had been intermittent, measured, the kind of sound that could be assigned to a background and ignored. Now it was continuous, in the way that rain becomes continuous when the storm has fully arrived. It was no longer background. It was the air itself. Margaret had stopped noticing it. That was something she would reflect on later, the way the mind, when it is fully occupied, simply removes from awareness the things it cannot do anything about. The artillery was one of those things. The men in front of her were not. The triage ward had been reorganized twice in the past 2 hours. What had started as a single row of cots along the south wall was now 3 rows, extending nearly to the tent entrance, with a narrow corridor between the rows barely wide enough to walk through sideways. Every cot was occupied. Some men were on field litters on the ground. George Peel was moving between the rows, taking readings, passing the numbers to Margaret as she worked. He had stopped looking frightened. He had the focused, slightly distant expression of someone who has decided to be useful as a way of surviving the night, and it was working. His hands were still steady. His voice, when he spoke to the patients, remained even. Frank Adler had come back from wherever he had been and was working alongside them. Frank was not cutting corners tonight. Margaret had not said anything to him about it. She had simply placed him, by the nature of where she needed people, in positions where cutting corners was not possible, and he had risen to it, because Frank Adler was not a bad person, and bad situations had a way of reminding people of what they were capable of when reminded. At 12:20 in the morning, A man named Corporal Eddie Grant arrived without dog tags. He had been carried in by two men from his unit, who set him down on a field litter inside the tent entrance, and stood there looking at Margaret with expressions that asked everything, without saying anything. She knelt beside him. He was unconscious. His breathing was audible and irregular. He was pale in the lamplight, in a way that read clearly to someone who knew how to read it. She looked for his tags. Nothing. She looked for any field documentation that had traveled with him. Nothing. The two men who had brought him in had his first name and the name of his unit, and nothing else. No blood type, no medical history, no previous treatment record. She checked his arms for old scarring that might indicate a known condition. She checked his teeth. She checked the color and temperature of his skin at the wrist and the neck. She pressed carefully along his abdomen and his chest, and watched his face while she did it, even though he was unconscious. Because the body responds even when the mind is not present. She formed a picture. It was incomplete. It was built from fragments, the way his body was positioned, the quality of his breathing, the specific pattern of his pallor, the temperature differential between his hands and his forearms. She made a call on blood type. She did not announce that she was making this call. She simply placed him in the preparation queue with the notation in the margin of his intake form, written in her own hand, in small clear letters that said, Type O negative. Clinical assessment, no documentation. That notation, later, would be the subject of a conversation she did not anticipate, and would find both important and irrelevant, in the way that administrative conversations about life and death decisions are always both important and irrelevant. But right now, Corporal Eddie Grant needed to be in the queue, and now he was. She stood up. She moved to the next patient. At 12:55, the OR tent flap opened, and Dr. Grubb came out. He was moving slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man whose legs are not fully trusting him, but who is not yet ready to stop. He had been operating for over 10 hours. His face had the carved, empty look of extreme exhaustion. Not blankness, but the opposite of it. Every unnecessary expression stripped away, leaving only the essential. He was walking toward his bunk. Margaret intercepted him at the compound crossing. I have 4 that need a physician review before the night is out, she said. She did not say, I know you are exhausted. She did not say, I'm sorry to do this. Both of those things were true, and neither of them were what he needed to hear. Grubb stopped walking. He stood there in the dark with the artillery moving the air around them both. Give me the chart notes, he said. She handed him the clipboard. He read without speaking for 3 minutes, using her flashlight. He handed the clipboard back. The first and the third, tonight. The second and fourth can wait until morning if they hold. He paused. They'll hold? I think so, she said. I'll watch them. He nodded. He did not say thank you. He went back toward the OR. She watched him go. She thought about Augustus the dog, and the photograph, and the letter that had made Philip Grubb light-footed that morning, and she thought about how the distance between that morning and this moment in the dark felt like something measured in units that weren't hours. She went back to her ward. The 2 patients Grubb had moved to priority, a young private named Lewis Holt, and a man of indeterminate age who had told George Peel his name was Calvin Reeves, and then said nothing else, were both assessed, prepared, and moved into the surgical queue by 1:30. The OR was running on a rhythm now, not the rhythm of normal surgical work, which has its own pace and its own particular silence. This was a compressed, forced rhythm, the rhythm of people working at the edge of what their hands and their minds could sustain. Margaret could hear it through the tent wall, not the sounds of the surgery itself, but the sound of people working at their limit. There is a sound to that, distinct from ordinary effort. She had learned to recognize it. She kept her ward fed into that rhythm steadily and carefully, like a person feeding paper to a fire, not too fast, not too slow. Managing the flow. Keeping it even. At 1:45 in the morning, Private Alan Norris came out of surgery and went into recovery. He was alive. He was going to stay alive. Margaret moved through recovery on her way to somewhere else, and she passed his cot, and she looked at him for exactly the amount of time it took to confirm that he was where he was supposed to be. That was all. There was no moment, no pause, no acknowledgement between them. She was already looking at the next cot before she had fully passed his. The night was not done. At 2 o'clock, Leonard Cole stepped out of the OR. He did not come looking for her. He came out for air, she thought, or for the brief pause that was the only alternative to collapsing. And he stood in the space between the OR tent and the triage tent, with his hands at his sides and his head slightly forward, and he breathed. He looked up when she passed him. She stopped. Not because she was required to. Not because he had called her name, but because there was something in the way he was standing, something that didn't fit his usual architecture, that made stopping the correct thing to do. He looked at her for a moment. "How many in triage?" he asked. 14 active, 6 in the queue, 4 holding. He nodded. He looked toward the mountains that were not visible in the dark. "The Norris call," he said. It was not a question. It was not a compliment. It was a man acknowledging a fact that he had decided to acknowledge. She said nothing. "Good catch," he said. Then he went back inside. She stood there for a moment in the dark by herself. The artillery was a constant presence. The cold was what it always was. Somewhere inside the compound, a man was moaning in a low, rhythmic way that meant he was in pain but conscious and holding. That particular sound that was not the sound of emergency, only of endurance. She buttoned the top button of her jacket. She went back to work. Between 2 o'clock and 3:47 in the morning, she made 11 decisions that were not, strictly speaking, within her assigned authority. She ordered a treatment adjustment on a patient whose chart had been set by a physician who had seen him 4 hours earlier and hadn't had time to reassess. She redirected a surgical prep for a patient who had developed a new symptom since being placed in the queue. She overruled Frank Adler twice, both times without raising her voice, both times correctly. She also lost someone. His name was Private Samuel Cross. He was from Minnesota. He was 22 years old. He had arrived in the second-to-last truck with a chest wound that was survivable. It had been survivable. But the combination of time and cold and the delay caused by the late arrival had moved him past the point where survivable was still the right word. She was with him when it happened. She had stayed with him because she had looked at his face and understood, with the certainty of someone who has learned to read those faces, that he should not be alone for this part. She held his hand. She said his name. She did not tell him it would be all right, because she did not know that it would be, and she had never been able to offer comfort she didn't believe in. What she offered was presence, steady, quiet, complete. When it was over, she stood up. She made the notation in the chart. She closed the curtain around the cot. She stood outside the curtain for the length of 3 full breaths. Then she went back to the ward. George Peel was waiting at the entrance. He had seen her face when she came through, and he understood without being told. He said nothing. He handed her the next chart. She took it. She read it. She moved. At 3:20, Corporal Eddie Grant went into surgery with the blood type Margaret had assigned him from clinical assessment alone. The type was correct. It was confirmed during the procedure by Dr. Grubb, who took 20 seconds to look up from the table and locate Margaret through the tent wall, with the particular awareness of a man who wants to verify something before he decides how to think about it. He could not see her through the tent wall, but he noted the time. He would write it in his own personal log that night, when the night was finally over, in handwriting that was less steady than usual. At 3:47 in the morning, the last critical patient in the triage ward was stabilized and moved to recovery. Margaret stood in the middle of the empty ward. Empty was not quite the right word. There were still men on cots, still men requiring monitoring and care. But the acute phase was over. The night had broken. Whatever it had been building toward had peaked and was receding now, the way floodwater recedes, slowly, leaving everything rearranged. She looked at the ward. She counted, the way she had been counting all night without consciously doing it, the running tally she kept in the back of her mind alongside everything else, the count of the ones who had come in and were still there, still breathing, still present in the world. The number was not a number she announced. It was not a number she wrote in her chart or said aloud. It was simply a number she carried. The way people carry things that matter to them. Privately, carefully, without display. 17. She put her clipboard down on the supply table. Outside, the artillery had stopped. She noticed its absence the way you notice silence after a long sound, as a thing with its own texture, its own weight. Someone had put a mug of coffee on the edge of the supply table beside the door. She did not know who. She did not know when. She picked it up. She went outside. She sat on a supply crate. The mountains were becoming visible in the east. The sky was the color of something beginning. The coffee was cold, but she held the mug anyway, for the warmth of the ceramic against her palms, and she looked at the mountains until they were fully visible. She looked at her hands for a long time. Then she went back inside. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, and she was the person who did it. The official after-action report was filed by Captain Leonard Cole at 0830 hours on October 15th. It ran to 4 pages. It covered the volume of casualties received, the number of surgical procedures performed, the status of patients currently in recovery, the consumption of medical supplies, and a set of recommendations regarding unit capacity and resupply needs. It was thorough in the way that official documents are thorough, complete within the boundaries of what they are designed to contain, and silent about everything outside those boundaries. Margaret Wilkins's name appeared once, in the nursing roster section, listed alphabetically among the unit's nursing staff. Her duties that night were recorded as triage support and patient monitoring. She read it the following afternoon, standing at the supply counter where it had been left for review. She read it without expression. Then she filed her own portion of the night's documentation, the triage assessments, the patient notes, the intake forms with her handwritten notations in the margins, and placed them in the correct folder in the correct order, and went back to work. Dr. Philip Grubb wrote a separate document that same day. He addressed it to the unit commander, Major Franklin Hatch, a quiet, deliberate man who had spent 20 years in the Army, and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned, over a long time, to distinguish between what is urgent and what is important. Grubb's document was not a formal commendation. It was a memo. It was written in careful, measured language, the language of a physician who understood the weight of what he was putting on paper and was choosing his words with the precision of someone who did not want to be misunderstood. It described specific clinical decisions made during the night of October 14th. It described their outcomes. It described the professional judgment and the knowledge base that those decisions required. Near the end of the memo, in a sentence that stood somewhat apart from the clinical language surrounding it, Grubb wrote that what he had witnessed that night was extraordinary. He used only that word. He did not elaborate. Major Hatch read the memo. He read it twice, which was his habit with documents that required thinking rather than just processing. He wrote a brief cover note and forwarded it up the chain to the division medical officer. The division medical officer received it, acknowledged receipt, and filed it. The chain had other things moving through it. It was October 1950, and the chain was very full. The memo traveled upward, slowly. It moved through 3 offices in the following 5 weeks. At each office, someone read it and passed it forward. No one did anything decisive with it, because the mechanisms for doing something decisive with it were complicated. The commendation process for nurses in the Army of 1950 had been designed with a certain kind of service in mind, and the service Margaret had performed did not fit cleanly into any of the available categories. The paperwork infrastructure had not been built for this. And so it moved slowly, and then it stopped. Margaret did not know it had stopped. She was not, by that point, waiting for it. Private Darnell Hooks was discharged from the unit's recovery ward on October 19th. On his way out, he stopped at the nursing station. He stood there for a moment with his coat under his arm and his duffel bag over one shoulder, and he had the look of a man who has been trying to find the right words for several days and has decided, as a last resort, to write them down. He held out a folded piece of paper. Margaret took it. He nodded, once, and walked out. She unfolded it. She read it. She refolded it into quarters and put it in the left breast pocket of her uniform, in the place where a commendation ribbon might have gone if the army had sent her one. In the weeks and months that followed, more men left. Some of them stopped at the nursing station on their way out. Some of them didn't. Of the ones who did, several had something written down, because Margaret Wilkins had the quality, rare in anyone, in any profession, in any circumstance, of making people feel that what had happened to them had been witnessed, really witnessed, not processed, not managed, seen. People who have been truly seen in their worst moments tend to want to say so. The folded papers accumulated. She kept them in the left breast pocket when she was on duty. At night, she put them in a small tin box that she kept in the bottom of her duffel bag. She did not take them out and read them. She did not need to. She knew what they contained. Leonard Cole requested a meeting with her in late November. He sat across from her in his tent with his hands flat on the table in the particular posture of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has decided to stop thinking and start speaking. He said, "What you did on the 14th, I want to understand how you knew." It was not an apology. It was not a compliment. It was a question from a doctor to another doctor, and they both understood it as such, even though only one of them was officially a doctor and the other one was officially a nurse. She told him about the field manual. She told him about the night rounds and the things she had noticed, and the adjustments she had made without reporting them. She told him about Darnell Hooks and the 2 minutes she had spent deciding, which had not really been 2 minutes spent deciding, but 1 minute of fear and 1 minute of accepting that the fear was not relevant to the outcome. Cole listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been doing this for 18 years. He did not finish the sentence. She understood what he was leaving unsaid, that in 18 years, he had not thought to hand a field manual to a nurse and ask her to read it. That in 18 years, the model of who held knowledge and who held a clipboard had seemed fixed and sensible, and had apparently not required examination. She did not say, "It wasn't fixed and it wasn't sensible, and it should have required examination long before this." She could have said it, but the evening was almost finished and she was tired. And some truths are better left to sit in the room without being spoken aloud, because the room already knows them. She left his tent. She went back to her bunk. She lay down with her coat over her shoulders and her hands folded on her chest, and she looked at the canvas ceiling of the tent for a while in the dark. She thought about Ohio, about the hospital in Columbus where she had not taken the job, about the paperwork she would have managed, and the coffee orders she would have written down, and the gap between that life and this one, this cold and exhausting and essential life, a gap so wide she could not see across it from either side. She thought about Samuel Cross, the boy from Minnesota who had not come home. She thought about him more than she thought about the others, not because he was more important than the others, but because he was the one she had not been able to hold on to, and that was a different kind of weight. The tin box was in her duffel bag. 17 papers. One of them had traveled to a family in Minnesota after the war, sent by Margaret herself, in an envelope with a letter that took her 2 months to write. She had not kept a copy. She had not needed to. She had written it from the part of herself that did not forget. She went home in 1952, to Columbus, Ohio. She went back to nursing. She took a position at a hospital where the most critical decision she made on any given Tuesday was, sometimes, actually the most critical decision anyone made in that building that day. She had learned enough, in Korea, to see that clearly. She married a civil engineer named Arthur Wilkins who thought she was remarkable in the specific, sober way of someone who has had time to form an accurate opinion and has not revised it. They had 2 children. They lived in a house with a good kitchen and a backyard that backed up against a small hill that caught the evening light. She kept the tin box under the bed. She did not talk about Korea with many people. When she did, she talked about the mountains, about how they looked almost like Ohio, in the way that a thing can look familiar while being entirely itself. She said this more than once, to different people, over many years, and it always seemed to satisfy the question being asked, which was usually less about the mountains and more about whether she was all right. She was all right. She was better than all right. She had done the thing she was built to do, in the place it needed to be done, and the evidence of it was a tin box under a bed in Columbus, Ohio, folded into quarters, worn at the creases from being held. Her daughter, a woman named Helen who had her mother's eyes and her father's patience, found the box in 1987 while helping Margaret move from the house to a smaller apartment after Arthur died. She sat on the bedroom floor with the box on her lap and she opened it. 17 papers, all different handwriting, different paper, different dates. Some of them were long, some of them were a single sentence. One of them had a small drawing in the corner, a rough sketch of mountains, in pencil, by someone who was not a skilled artist but had been trying to capture something specific. Helen read them, one by one, sitting on the bedroom floor, while her mother made tea in the kitchen. When she came out to the kitchen, Margaret looked up and saw her daughter's face. She did not say anything. She poured the tea. Helen sat down. She put the box on the table between them. "You never told me," she said. Margaret picked up her tea. She looked at the window, where the late afternoon light came in, at the angle it had always come in. "You didn't ask," she said. It was not unkind. It was simply the truth about a woman who had spent her life doing the work and not requiring the asking, who had put her hand out when it was needed and pulled it back when the moment passed and gone on to the next thing, the next patient, the next night, the next morning. Helen reached across the table. She put her hand over her mother's hand. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen, in the afternoon light, while the tea cooled in their cups. The mountains had looked like Ohio almost. She had been home for a long time now, and Ohio looked like itself. The tin box stayed in Helen's keeping after that. She was careful with it. She understood, without her mother needing to explain it, that the box was not memorabilia. It was not a collection. It was something closer to a record kept not by an institution or an official history, but by the people who were there, in the specific language of people who are still trying to put into words something that happened to them and has not finished happening. In 1991, a Veterans Oral History Project came to Columbus as part of a national effort to record the experiences of Korean War veterans and the medical personnel who served alongside them. A researcher named William Park came to Margaret Wilkins's apartment. She was 67 by then, still sharp, still direct, still carrying the particular stillness of someone who learned long ago not to fill silence with noise. And he sat across from her with a tape recorder and a yellow legal pad, and he asked her about Korea. She talked for 3 hours. She talked about the cold and the mountains and the way the tent walls moved during artillery. She talked about Darnell Hooks and Alan Norris and Eddie Grant, and she said their names clearly and completely, the way she had always said them, because names were not details. She talked about Philip Grubb and his dog Augustus, and the way he had come back to the OR after 10 hours and taken the chart from her in the dark. She talked about Leonard Cole. She talked about Samuel Cross. When she spoke about Samuel Cross, she did so briefly. One sentence about him, and then a pause, and then she moved forward. The researcher noted the pause. He did not fill it. He understood what it meant. William Park asked her, near the end of the interview, whether she had felt angry, about the after-action report, about the commendation that did not come, about the word extraordinary that had traveled 3 offices up the chain and then stopped. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I felt busy." She let that sit. Then she said, "I think anger requires a certain amount of spare time. I didn't have spare time." Park wrote that down verbatim. He wrote it down because it was the most accurate thing he had heard in 2 years of collecting oral histories, and because it said something not just about Margaret Wilkins but about a particular kind of person, the kind that history tends to move around rather than toward, that does the essential work without waiting for the essential work to be acknowledged. The interview was archived at the Library of Congress. The transcript ran to 47 pages. The tin box was photographed for the archive. The papers inside it were not read publicly. Margaret had asked that they remain personal, and the request was honored. She died in 2003, at the age of 79, in Columbus, Ohio. The obituary in the local paper was modest. It listed her years of service. It used the phrase distinguished career, which was accurate and insufficient in equal measure. Helen kept the tin box. She had read all 17 papers on the bedroom floor in 1987, but she read them again after her mother died, not all at once. Over time, one at a time, the way you read things that matter when you are ready for each one, and not before. Samuel Cross's paper was the last one she read. It was different from the others. It was not from Samuel Cross. It was to him. In her mother's handwriting, careful and level, dated March of 1953, written from Columbus, Ohio, 8 months after Margaret came home. It was not a long letter. It did not try to make sense of what had happened. It did not look for the lesson or the meaning or the larger purpose. It was simply a woman writing to a young man from Minnesota, telling him that she remembered, that she had been there, and she had seen him, and she was still carrying that it mattered. The letter was worn at the creases, deeply, thoroughly worn. The creases of something that had been folded and unfolded many times, not in the first years perhaps, but in the later years, when the sharp edge of grief had softened into something more sustainable and more present at once. Helen sat with it for a long time. Then she folded it back along its creases, carefully, the way her mother had always folded things, and she put it back in the box with the others. She thought about the research team at the Library of Congress. She thought about the 47-page transcript and the photograph of the box. She thought about the word extraordinary in Philip Grubb's memo, written in a tent in Korea in October 1950, by a man who had been operating for 10 hours and who had taken the time, in the middle of all of it, to find the right word. She thought about her mother in that kitchen, picking up her tea, looking at the light in the window. You didn't ask. Helen had asked now. She had read everything there was to read, and she understood, finally, the shape of the thing her mother had carried. Not a burden, not a wound, but a responsibility. The kind that doesn't end because the work ends. The kind you carry forward. She took the tin box home. She put it on the shelf in her study, where she could see it. There were 17 papers inside it, and one letter, and the sum of them was not a monument. It was not a commendation or a medal or an inscription on a wall. It was just the record of what one person did when it mattered, held in the handwriting of the people who were there, folded into quarters, worn at the creases from being held. That was all. It was enough.